title is Named Coinages in Shakespeare's Histories. And my presentation is simply the first part of a prose article I submitted to Names about Shakespeare's coinages of names in both his histories and tragedies. And my submission has been accepted pending major revision, which I'll pursue with amazing vigor in the coming weeks. My goal here is to present a reduced version of my introduction and to describe my examples from the history plays. My examples from the tragedies may be found in the full article when and if it appears. Much has been written about Shakespeare's coinage of words, but my work focuses just on his coinage of names. And of course, Shakespeare's coinages are a part of his general usage of names. And the central observation of this paper is that he uses names much differently in his histories and tragedies than in his comedies. As I describe exhaustively in my recent book, Names as Metaphors in Shakespeare's Comedies, Shakespeare typically ignored all or almost all of the names he found in his many plot sources for the comedies. Instead, he substituted other names to color his own development of the characters and themes. Most of the names he used in comedies were borrowed not from the plot sources themselves, but from other works of literature, such as the name Proteus and Two Gentlemen of Verona, which can be found in many classical works. Such borrowings function as descriptive analogs. Also, over time, Shakespeare used an increasing number of coinages, which also function etymologically, such as the name Shylock, referring to a hairstyle, or perdita, referring to that which is squandered. Thus, the names in Shakespeare's comedies show his thematic reinterpretation of his source plots and his presumption of their fictive status. By contrast, in his histories and tragedies, Shakespeare typically used each and every name that he found in his plot sources. A thorough analysis of these names, along with generic references, might help to illustrate his vision of social order, especially in his use of generic labels and common names. The absence of borrowed names, his general reliance on the primary source plots, his apparent presumption of their non-fictive status, and clear linguistic differences among his coinages and unexpected patterns of his imagination. However, a comprehensive study of all names in the histories and tragedies is not essential, even if useful. All of these issues can be at least partially illustrated by focusing just on his name coinages. Coinages are about one type of name used by Shakespeare and are a small percentage of the total corpus of his names and generic references. By coinages, I mean names that are not found in primary source plots, not borrowed from other literary sources, and not in common use. They are unique combinations of phonological units that suggest thematically relevant attributes of the characters. They have meaning that is symbolic in a semiotic sense. Now, as onomastic scholars, our ultimate purpose in analyzing any and all names in literature should be to understand their thematic relevance, not just to catalog their different types. Shakespeare's coinages typify his uses of names, and my analyses here are, as elsewhere, they emphasize the thematic relevance, especially in the following example of Falstaff. By looking specifically at the coinages as a specific type of name, we can make reasonable assessments of Shakespeare's relative reliance or independence from his source plots, the relative cultural relevance of and imaginative reach of his topical references, differences in the thematic importance of characters based on languages which they are often derived. For analytical purposes, it is useful to distinguish two types of coinages, lexical and etymological. Lexical coinages are those based on meanings in early modern English. They may combine common lexical elements in a literal but unusual way to describe the action, attitude, or appearance of characters. For example, thump, Falstaff, or poins, in that order. Or they may combine phonological units that lack literal reference, but still suggest meaningful even if ambiguous associations. The name Walter is a pun in Henry VI, Part 2 on the word water. That is to say, lexical coinages may be described as lexical equivalents or as phonological approximations. Etymological coinages are derivations from other languages, usually Latin, and have meanings in those languages that are thematically relevant, such as the name Corambus and from the Polonius character in the first quarto of Hamlet, which means double-hearted or two-faced. Occasionally, Shakespeare also used sounds of his etymological coinages to evoke common lexical meaning in English. For example, the name Silius describes a very silly character in Antony and Cleopatra. The proportions of lexical and etymological coinages change over time. As his career progressed, Shakespeare used relatively more etymological coinages. Also, he generally coined names derived from Latin for characters with aristocratic status and used lexical coinages more often for secondary characters or characters with commoner status. Significant differences may be seen between the histories, tragedies, and comedies in both the number and the two types of coinages. There are only 19 coinages in the 10 history plays. All but one are the lexical type, and all but 3 are in the Henry IV fifth plays. There are 25 coinages in the 11 tragedies, 10 of which are etymological and 15 lexical. The vast majority of Shakespeare's coinages, 157, are in his 15 comedies, illustrating his use of plots for comedies that he appears to have considered fictive and therefore appropriate for a complete reinterpretation and rewriting. In the history plays, coinages are notably sparse in Shakespeare's early history plays, indicating his close adherence to plot sources and suggesting his presumption of their status as non-fictive. His two dominant sources were Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed. Geoffrey Bull provides convenient excerpts from these sources in his narrative and dramatic sources. The Henry VI plays and Richard III were his earliest history plays, and almost all names in these plays come from the history books by Hall and Holinshed. Most names are those of the fractious nobles, but some are also names for commoners found in the sources, such as the rebel Jack Cade. Also, Shakespeare sometimes adds generics and common names, such as Dick the Butcher for the famous phrase, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." However, among more than 500 distinct character references in these very early plays, including generics, there are only 3 examples of coinage. Shakespeare names the murderer of the Duke of Suffolk, Walter, in order to pun on the word water. Duke Suffolk believes he is safe because of a prophecy that by water I should die, but he is murdered by the hired thug named Walter. Thus, the prophecy was fulfilled, heightening the irony of the character's expectations. Shakespeare also alters the spelling of Suffolk in the first part of Henry VI, as I shall explain in a moment. A very simple example of coinage is the name Peter Thump in Henry IV, Part 2, Henry VI, pardon me, Part 2. The name Thump is an obvious lexical equivalent, meaning to strike or beat heavily, as with a fist, and the name Peter might easily suggest the stalwart apostle and first leader of the Church of Rome. This combination of names effectively foreshadows the dramatic action. Paul mentions an unnamed apprentice, an armorer's servant, who challenged his own master to combat for suggesting that Henry VI was not a rightful monarch. Shakespeare highlights this apprentice by giving him a name, Peter Thump. And in the trial by combat, the apprentice strikes him down with a resounding blow, as the meaning of the name implies, thereby justifying Thump's earnest prayers and his belief in the king's sovereignty, and probably eliciting cheers from the many apprentices who stood as groundlings in front of Shakespeare's stage. These two names in Henry VI, Part 2, Walter and Thump, plus a brief mention of Falstaff, are the only unmistakable examples of coinage in Shakespeare's early tetralogy. And their thematic importance is limited to individual scenes. Thus, even though these few examples reflect the thematic potential of name coinages, the paucity of such examples suggests Shakespeare's close adherence to his sources and his implicit presumption of the historic verisimilitude. Later history plays include many lexical equivalents, often referred to as SAG names or redunda nomen. And Shakespeare's coinages of such names was roughly precipitated by his need to change a few names in Henry IV, Part 1, especially of the character we now know as Falstaff. When the character first appears in Henry IV, Part 1, the word old is used as the speech prefix, and Hal refers to him as my old lad of the castle. Thus, editors commonly assume that Shakespeare originally used the name Sir John Oldcastle as the reference for this character, which corresponds to the actual personage in the historical sources. That historical personage was Sir John Oldcastle, also known as Lord Cobham, who was a leading Lollard executed for heresy in 1417. The Lollards were followers of John Wycliffe, a proto-Protestant reformer. And in his initial drafts of Henry IV, Part 1, Shakespeare apparently used this historical reference for ridicule, as he usually did in his references to Puritans. However, at the time of Henry IV, Part 1, avid Protestants viewed the historical Lord Cobham as an early martyr. And among them was the current Lord Cobham, Sir William Brooke, who presumably objected to the disreputable portrayal of his ancestor. Because of Brooke's objections and or to appeal to the widest possible audience, Shakespeare apparently changed the name Oldcastle to Falstaff and made a special point of disassociating his character from the Cobham lineage in the epilogue of Henry IV, Part 2. Oldcastle died a martyr, and this is not the man. To make the change in names, Shakespeare needed only to return to his historical sources and his earlier play, Henry VI, Part 1. There he found a personage named General Fastolfe, who from the battle departed without any stroke stricken. At that battle, the English hero, John Talbot, lionized by historians and also by Shakespeare, was killed at the end of the 100 Years' War. By escaping from Patay, Fastolfe was accused of cowardice by the Duke of Bedford at that time and later vilified in Shakespeare's play, Henry VI, Part 1. As part of his ridicule, Shakespeare played with the spelling of Fastolfe found in Hall by moving the letter L from the second syllable to the first syllable, thus coining the name of Falstaff, which describes the presumed illegitimacy of his noble status, and or refers to a staff for holding a military flag or banner as false, or that falls. Because it reinforces the important theme of cowardice, the change in spelling is not likely a casual mistake, but in fact, a descriptive coinage, ridiculing the character. As a thematic reference to cowardice, the name Falstaff, clipping the final E, was a good substitute for the Oldcastle name and highlights in a simple lexical meaning the character's cynical morality and his ridicule of honor at the Battle of Shrewsbury. This brief lexical reference of the name in Henry VI, Part 1 has symbolic meaning because it also transfers easily to describe Falstaff's cowardice in the Gad's Hill robbery and to reinforce a host of thematic images that run through Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and Merry Wives of Windsor. In Merry Wives of Windsor, the lexical value of Falstaff's name is again broadened symbolically to suggest his failures in romance. To remedy his financial distress, Falstaff devises a plan to seduce mistresses Ford and Page in order to extort their money. But just as in the Gad's Hill robbery of Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff's plan is easily thwarted. Mistresses Ford and Page ridicule his insipid and identical love letters. They rail about his shameless duplicity, and they conspire to lead him on through a series of assignations, the purpose of which is to punish him with gross indignities and tangible pain. The last assignation is a public humiliation, culminating with the children dancing around him, pinching him, burning him with candles, and singing, "Fie on sinful fantasy, fie on lust and luxury." Falstaff laments, "It is enough to be the decay of lusts." Because his failure is foreshadowed throughout the play, the phallic symbolism of Falstaff's name becomes unmistakable. The second syllable is a phallic reference, and the first syllable refers to the comic futility of his sexual fantasies, reinforced in the end by his own reference to the decay of lust. Thus, Falstaff's name has multiple references, including his enfeebled masculinity. In the development of 3 plays, the name evolves symbolically and marks a turning point in Shakespeare's use of coinages in many plays. That is to say, the political pressure exerted by Lord Cobham on Shakespeare to avoid a reference to the historical Sir John Oldcastle appears to have led not only to the coinage of Falstaff, which poeticizes the themes of both cowardice and degeneracy, but also to Shakespeare's lessened dependence on sources regarded as non-fictive, and to greater use of his own graphic analogs, which illustrates his general pursuit of thematic goals in his uses of names, and is typified and typifies his use of coinages. Changing Oldcastle to Falstaff led to other changes in Henry IV, Part 1. Let's say he changed the names Russell and to Bardolph and Harvey to Pito to avoid apparent references to other powerful nobles. The Bardolph name was probably a satirical reference to Baron Bardolph, who aided Henry Percy's rebellion of 1403. The name then reappears in the second part of Henry IV and Henry V and Mary Wives of Windsor, very simply as a red-faced drunkard, and probably denotes an actor who had endeared himself with audiences of Henry IV, Part 1, with his portrayal of drunkenness and stupid incompetence. Pito, by contrast, is Italian for fart, presumably, and is an example, therefore, of etymological coinages and of Shakespeare's flippant humor. Other thematic coinages in Henry IV, Part 1 include Mistress Quickly and Poins. It has been suggested that the name Mistress Quickly refers to her as a quick lay, a titillating analogy to modern ears, but she is surprisingly eloquent as the Queen of Fairies in Mary Wives of Windsor. Thus, her most consistent attribute is her play with words of all sorts. As I say, the name is descriptive. She is quick in her repartee and nimble with malapropisms, misinterpreting her own words and those of others, often with salacious meanings. Like the name Bardolph, the name Mistress Quickly probably became identified with a specific actor whose verbal agility delighted audiences, which Shakespeare sought to please with return appearances. She reappears in Henry IV, Part 2, Henry V, and Mary Wives of Windsor. Poins likewise appears in both Henry IV, Part 1 and Henry IV, Part 2 as a rowdy young prankster and a noble friend of the prince. His name is most likely a metonymical reference to his stage appearance, say to his lace ribbons, commonly worn by aristocrats and often referred to as points. Henry IV, Part 1 is significant because how political image forced Shakespeare to put some distance between himself and the names in his sources, and to coin his own names to coincide with his development of themes and character types, much as he does in his comedies. His coinages are thereby a measure of his lessened reliance on his authoritative sources and of his greater reliance on topical references and his lexical imagination. After staging Henry IV, Part 1, 5 coinages appear to carry forward with popular actors in the sequels. In addition, Henry IV Part 2 includes 8 new lexical coinages. Henry V follows with 3 more new ones, bringing the total to 16 coinages in these 3 plays. In the other history plays, by contrast, there are only 2 coinages in Henry VI Part 2, 1 in Henry VI Part 1, and none in Henry VI Part 3 of Richard III, Richard II, or King John, or in the much later Henry VIII. Notably, all the coinages in the history plays have clear lexical meaning. Only pedo seems to be a likely derivation from another language. Please take care and be well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Grant. That was great. Can't wait to see the paper when it shows up in names. It's going to be terrific. So we have some time for questions. I have a quick question about the coinages. I know you said that it counted as a coinage if it wasn't in primary sources or contemporary historical records. Can we ever be sure that these were really Shakespeare's coinages, or perhaps they were floating around at the time and just weren't recorded anywhere?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's often assumed that Shakespeare, at the very least, had a very good memory and keen ear for the street, and that his fellow actors might throw in, a line or 2 here and there that he would then poeticize, put into, a form or flow of the language. Yeah, sure. But he's amazingly, productive of coinages, of course, within the language as a whole, predominantly so. But he was in the time of early modern English. So his words were maybe from the street, but they are part of a, poetic flow also, and metrical form. They really grab us because of their poetry. And what I tried to do with the Falstaff name is to show how easily it could be formed by simply flipping the letter L, and it's a very common kind of flippant remark, really. But then it germinates and expands in its symbolic value. It grows as the character is developed. And so the naming is a part of character development and theme development. And I think that particularly the name Falstaff is a good illustration of that as we look at it as it changes form from play to play.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's pretty much what I was thinking. I think Chris has a question, yes? Can we unmute her?
Thanks so much, Grant. I really liked your presentation. And as Laurel said, we'll all be looking forward to seeing it when it comes out. Here's a question that I had. It would seem to me in your commenting about the histories that Shakespeare as author is so constrained by the fact that he's presenting a history and therefore wants to be faithful to the names in the history, that there is less opportunity for creativity. But that doesn't seem to have squelched any of his creativity in creating the play itself. So would you comment on whether you think that he would have found this restrictive or not?
Well, I think it's a question of his own presumption of the veracity or the authority of his historical sources. Certainly in the Henry VI plays and the two Richard plays, Richard I, Richard II, actually Richard II and Richard III. Richard III comes first, Richard II comes later. Very few coinages are in those plays. We do see a couple of throwaways here and there that are illustrative, like Peter Thump. That's clearly a Shakespearean type of reference. And and then when we get to Henry IV, Part 1, he is confronted by the Protestant objections. And we can see in so many of their plays when he's referring to the Puritans, really severe ridicule. Malvolio, for example, is a prime example. He's referred to as a Puritan and held to absurd ridicule, well, and thoroughly deserving. So, and the very name, of course, of Malvolio and Benvolio, these are clearly etymological derivations, that he's creating. Now, he wouldn't hear that on the street. He wouldn't, so he's making this up pretty much, I think he's pretty self-reliant, and he's the poet, he's the genius at work here. Particularly in these etymological examples, Perdita, Miranda, Prospero. He's playing with languages that he knows.
Great.
I have a question about Shakespeare's histories. You have the history given by Shakespeare in Hamlet and Richard III and Julius Caesar and Henry the anything.
King Lear.
Yes, you have Shakespeare's presentation of the history, and then you have the historical nonfiction books giving these same histories, and they're not always exactly the same. And it seems to me that I know a lot more about Richard III and Julius Caesar and Henry the anything from Shakespeare than I do from any of the history books. So
Right.
It may be wrong, but it certainly has affected me.
Well, certainly that's an excellent point, and so much controversy has risen from his characterization of Richard III. In other words, he vilifies Richard III as a devil in disguise, a hunchback, but so very, very clever with language. He's able to seduce, Princess Anne and everything. What a marvelous devil he is. And of course, he is able to create the devil of Iago. And the invention of the name Iago, of course, refers to the Spanish Santiago, the killer of Moors, which I'll get into. But he is not a rigorous historian. He is, in some ways, a propagandist for the existing monarchy at the time. He's following the line to keep himself in favor with the ruling aristocracy. No doubt about it, particularly so in Richard III.
Great question. We are at the time now. Thank you so much, Grant. That was so interesting. Great questions also.